In the forgotten archives of Alta County, New York, buried beneath decades of bureaucratic silence, lies a document that has haunted every clerk brave enough to read it. The 1867 inspection report of the House of Religious Correction for Wayward Women details the systematic torture and exploitation of 456 women over 33 years. What makes this document truly terrifying isn't just the cruelty it describes, but the discovery that 3 siblings, Patrick, Kathleen, and Sean Hudson, had convinced an entire community that their monstrous acts were divine intervention. The official records were sealed by order of the state legislature, buried so deep that most historians have never heard of the Hudson family's reign of terror. But tonight, we're going to uncover the truth about America's most sinister religious institution, where salvation was just another word for slavery. Before we continue with the story of the Hudson family and their house of horrors, I want you to know that this channel is dedicated to bringing you the darkest, most chilling stories from America's hidden past. If you're fascinated by the shadows lurking behind our nation's history, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. And I'd love to know, comment below and tell me what state or city you're listening from. Are there any dark legends from your area that you think we should investigate? The Hudson family story begins not with madness, but with what appeared to be genuine religious devotion, making their eventual crimes all the more chilling. New York State in the 1832nd was a landscape of moral reform and religious fervor. The Second Great Awakening had swept through the region like wildfire, leaving in its wake dozens of new religious movements, moral societies, and institutions dedicated to the betterment of human souls. It was an era when good Christian folk believed that any deviation from moral purity could be corrected through prayer, discipline, and unwavering faith in divine providence. Ulster County, nestled along the Hudson River Valley, embodied this spirit of moral crusade. The county seat of Kingston boasted 13 churches, 4 temperance societies, and a growing reputation as a beacon of Christian virtue. The rolling hills were dotted with prosperous Dutch farms, whose families had maintained strict Calvinist traditions for over 2 centuries. These were people who believed that moral corruption was a disease that could spread through communities like cholera, and that drastic measures were sometimes necessary to preserve the spiritual health of society. It was into this atmosphere of religious intensity that Patrick Hudson arrived in the spring of 1834, accompanied by his wife Kathleen and his younger brother Shah. Patrick was a tall, severe man with penetrating grey eyes and prematurely white hair that gave him an almost prophetic appearance. At 38, he carried himself with the authority of someone who had wrestled with sin and emerged victorious. Kathleen, 3 years younger, possessed the kind of austere beauty that seemed carved from marble. Pale skin stretched tight over sharp cheekbones, lips that rarely curved into anything resembling warmth. Shah, barely 25, had the soft features and gentle demeanor that made him appear almost angelic, a quality that would prove devastatingly deceptive. The Hudson siblings came to Alta County with impeccable credentials. Patrick presented letters of recommendation from ministers in Massachusetts, praising his innovative approaches to moral correction. He spoke eloquently about his calling to establish an institution where fallen women could find redemption through structured penance and spiritual guidance. The concept wasn't unusual. Moral reform institutions had been sprouting across New England and New York throughout the 1822nd and 1832nd, responding to growing concerns about prostitution, adultery, and other forms of female moral transgression. What set Patrick's proposal apart was his emphasis on religious correction rather than simple punishment. He argued that wayward women needed intensive spiritual therapy, combining physical labor, biblical study, and what he termed purification rituals to cleanse their souls of corruption. The local ministers and magistrates were impressed by his theological sophistication and his apparent dedication to Christian charity. When Patrick purchased a sprawling colonial mansion on the outskirts of Kingston, a former Dutch estate that had fallen into disrepair, the community saw it as a sign of divine providence. The mansion itself seemed perfectly suited to Patrick's vision. Built in 1712 by wealthy Dutch merchant Cornelius van der Burg, it sat on 47 acres of isolated farmland, surrounded by dense woods that provided natural privacy. The three-story structure featured thick stone walls, small windows, and a layout that could easily accommodate dormitories, workrooms, and administrative spaces. Most importantly, it included a cellar complex that Patrick claimed would be ideal for contemplation chambers, where the most troubled women could engage in solitary prayer and meditation. Throughout the summer of 1834, the Hudson family worked tirelessly to prepare their institution. Patrick oversaw the conversion of the mansion's rooms, installing heavy locks on doors and barring windows for the protection of residents who might be tempted to flee before completing their moral rehabilitation. Kathleen organized the domestic arrangements, designing schedules for prayer, work, and meals that would structure every moment of the residents' days. Sean, who had studied at a small theological seminary in Connecticut, prepared the spiritual curriculum that would form the foundation of their treatment program. The community watched these preparations with approval and anticipation. Local ministers praised Patrick's thorough approach to moral correction, noting his emphasis on scripture-based therapy and his commitment to treating each woman as a unique case requiring individualized attention. The county magistrate, Judge Hendrik Schuyler, was particularly impressed by Patrick's detailed treatment plans and his willingness to accept the most difficult cases, women whom other institutions had declared irredeemable. By October 1834, the House of Religious Correction for Wayward Women was ready to receive its first residents. The local newspaper, the Alta County Gazette, published a glowing article about the institution, describing it as a beacon of Christian hope for the most forsaken daughters of our society. The article noted that the Hudson family had refused any government funding, choosing instead to rely on private donations and what Patrick termed contributions from families seeking moral correction services. The first woman arrived on a cold November morning, brought by her father, who could no longer bear the shame of her conduct. Margaret Sutherland was 19 years old, the daughter of a prosperous merchant who had discovered her in what he termed compromising circumstances with a married man. Rather than face the scandal of a public disgrace, he had chosen to place his daughter in Patrick Hudson's care, paying a substantial fee for what he believed would be a year-long program of moral rehabilitation. As Margaret disappeared behind the heavy oak doors of the Hudson mansion, her father departed with the satisfaction of knowing he had done his Christian duty. He would never see his daughter again, though he would continue to receive monthly letters written in her hand, assuring him that her moral correction was proceeding according to God's plan. What he didn't know was that Margaret Sutherland had just become the first victim in a scheme so monstrous that it would eventually shock even the most hardened investigators who uncovered it 3 decades later. The House of Religious Correction for Wayward Women was about to become something far more sinister than anyone in Alta County could have imagined. A place where Christian virtue would serve as the perfect mask for unspeakable cruelty and exploitation. The transformation of Margaret Sutherland began within hours of her arrival at the Hudson mansion, though it would be years before anyone understood the true nature of what the family called their purification process. On that November evening in 1834, as autumn rain pelted the mansion's thick windows, Margaret experienced what she would later describe in testimony given under oath 33 years later as her first glimpse into hell. Patrick Hudson greeted Margaret in the mansion's main parlor, a room that retained much of its original Dutch colonial grandeur. Heavy wooden beams crossed the ceiling, and a massive stone fireplace dominated one wall, casting flickering shadows that danced across religious paintings and biblical verses painted directly onto the plaster. Patrick wore simple black clothing, his severe features softened by what appeared to be genuine compassion as he explained the institution's mission to save her immortal soul. "Miss Sutherland," he said in a voice that carried the cadence of practice sermons, "you have come to us as Magdalene came to our Savior, broken by sin, but yearning for redemption. Your Father has entrusted us with your spiritual welfare, and we do not take that responsibility lightly. The path to purification is not easy, but those who complete our program emerge, cleansed of their moral corruption, ready to take their rightful place in Christian society." Kathleen Hudson appeared as if summoned by some invisible signal, her austere beauty made more striking by the severe black dress she wore, its high collar fastened with a silver cross. She moved with the measured steps of someone accustomed to absolute authority, her cold blue eyes assessing Margaret with the calculating gaze of a livestock dealer examining a new acquisition. "The first step in moral correction," Kathleen explained, "is the abandonment of worldly vanity and the embracing of holy simplicity. You will surrender all personal possessions, including the clothing you wear, as these material things represent connections to your sinful past. We will provide you with appropriate garments that reflect your current status as a penitent seeking redemption." Margaret's protests were met with what appeared to be patient understanding. Shah Hudson, who had been standing quietly in the shadows, stepped forward with the gentle manner that had charmed the local ministers. His soft brown eyes radiated the kind of divine compassion that seemed to promise salvation to even the most lost souls. "I understand your fear, Margaret," he said, using her first name with the familiar intimacy of a spiritual counselor. "The devil whispers in your ear, telling you to resist the very salvation you came here to find. But we have seen this struggle countless times before, and we know how to help you overcome these sinful impulses. Trust in the Lord and trust in us. We are His servants, dedicated to your spiritual welfare." What happened next would haunt Margaret for the rest of her life, though she would not speak of it publicly until 1867, when investigators finally uncovered the truth about the Hudson family's methods. She was led to what Patrick called the preparation chamber, a small windowless room in the mansion's basement, where new residents underwent their initial purification ritual. The chamber had been carved from the mansion's original root cellar, its stone walls seeping moisture despite Patrick's attempts to make it more comfortable. Candles provided the only light, their flames creating an atmosphere that Patrick claimed was conducive to spiritual reflection. Religious iconography covered every surface: crosses, biblical verses, and paintings depicting the torments of sinful souls and the rewards of divine redemption. Margaret was instructed to remove her traveling dress and undergarments, replacing them with a simple grey shift that bore the words "penitent soul" embroidered across the chest. Her hair was cut short, not brutally shorn, but trimmed to a length that Patrick claimed would prevent the vanity that had contributed to her moral downfall. Her jewellery, money, and personal letters were placed in a wooden box that Patrick said would be returned to her upon completion of her rehabilitation. But it was what happened after this seemingly routine intake process that revealed the true nature of the Hudson family's institution. As Margaret stood shivering in her thin shift, Kathleen began what she called the examination of moral corruption, a procedure that involved intimate physical inspection under the guise of determining the extent of Margaret's spiritual contamination. "Sin leaves marks upon the body as well as the soul," Kathleen explained, her voice taking on the mechanical tone of someone reciting a well-practiced script. "We must understand the full scope of your moral degradation before we can design an appropriate treatment program. This examination is conducted with the utmost Christian propriety and is essential to your spiritual rehabilitation." What followed was a systematic violation disguised as medical necessity, conducted with clinical detachment that somehow made it more horrifying than overt brutality. Margaret's body was inspected, measured, and catalogued in a leather-bound journal that Kathleen maintained with meticulous care. Questions were asked about her sexual history, her monthly cycles, and her physical responses to various forms of stimulation, all under the pretense of assessing her moral corruption and designing appropriate purification treatments. The psychological component of this initial processing was equally devastating. Sean Hudson conducted what he called a spiritual interview, using his theological training to probe Margaret's deepest fears, desires, and shame. He possessed an uncanny ability to identify psychological vulnerabilities, asking questions that seemed designed to strip away her sense of self-worth and replace it with absolute dependence on the Hudson family's guidance. "Tell me about the moment you first experienced sinful desire," Shah prompted, his voice maintaining its gentle pastoral tone, even as his questions became increasingly invasive. "Help me understand how the devil first gained entry to your soul, so that we can work together to cast him out. Remember, nothing you tell me can shock or surprise me." I have heard confessions from hundreds of women, and I understand the particular ways that Satan tempts the female heart. By the time Margaret was finally allowed to rest in the small dormitory room she would share with 3 other women, she had been psychologically and physically violated in ways that left her questioning her own perceptions of reality. The Hudson family had demonstrated their absolute authority over her body and mind while maintaining the facade of Christian compassion and spiritual guidance. She was no longer Margaret Sutherland, daughter of a prosperous merchant. She was a penitent soul whose very identity now belonged to her religious correctors. What Margaret couldn't know was that she had just experienced the first phase of a systematic process that the Hudson family had perfected through careful study of their victims' psychological responses. Every aspect of the intake procedure had been designed to break down her sense of individual identity and replace it with complete submission to their authority. The religious framework provided both justification for their actions and protection from outside scrutiny, who would question the methods of devout Christians working to save fallen women. As Margaret lay awake that first night, listening to the quiet sobbing of her roommates and the strange sounds that echoed through the mansion's corridors, she began to understand that the House of Religious Correction for Wayward Women was something far different from what her father had believed he was purchasing for her moral welfare. But by then it was far too late to escape what the Hudson family had planned for her rehabilitation. The machinery of spiritual corruption had claimed another victim, and Margaret Sutherland's real education was just beginning. As winter settled over Ulster County in late 1834, the House of Religious Correction began to establish its rhythm of daily operations, and with it, the carefully orchestrated horror that would define the next 3 decades. Margaret Sutherland's experience had been the template. Every woman who entered the Hudson mansion underwent the same systematic process of psychological and physical domination, all disguised as intensive spiritual therapy. The Hudson family's genius lay not in their cruelty, but in their understanding of how religious authority could provide perfect camouflage for exploitation. Patrick had studied the methods of legitimate moral reform institutions, identifying the aspects of their programs that could be twisted to serve his own purposes. Morning prayers became opportunities for psychological manipulation. Bible study sessions were used to reinforce messages of female submission and the necessity of suffering as purification. Physical labor, supposedly designed to instill discipline and humility, became a means of weakening the women's physical resistance while generating profit through the sale of their work. By the spring of 1835, the institution housed 12 women, ranging in age from 16 to 31. They came from families throughout New York and New England, daughters whose sexual conduct had brought shame to respectable households, wives whose adultery had destroyed their marriages, and unmarried women whose pregnancies had made them social pariahs. Each family paid substantial fees for what they believed was intensive moral rehabilitation, never questioning why their daughters' letters home were so similar in tone and content, or why visits were consistently discouraged as disruptive to the spiritual healing process. The daily routine at the House of Religious Correction followed a schedule that Patrick had designed to maximize both control and productivity. The women rose at 5 o'clock for morning prayers, led by Sean Hudson in the mansion's converted chapel. His sermons focused relentlessly on themes of female corruption, the necessity of submission to male authority, and the particular ways that women's sinful nature made them susceptible to moral degradation. After prayers came a breakfast of thin porridge and weak tea, followed by 6 hours of labor in the mansion's workrooms. The women produced fine needlework, preserved foods, and handcrafted items that Kathleen sold to wealthy families throughout the Hudson Valley. The quality of their work was exceptional. Fear and desperation, it seemed, could inspire remarkable attention to detail. The income from these sales, combined with the fees paid by families, made the House of Religious Correction extremely profitable, though the Hudson family maintained the fiction that they operated their institution purely as a Christian charity. But it was the evening activities that revealed the true nature of the Hudson family's enterprise. After the evening meal and prayers, the women were subjected to what Patrick called individualized spiritual therapy. sessions that took place in the mansion's basement chambers and involved procedures that no legitimate religious institution would have sanctioned. These sessions were presented as essential components of the purification process, necessary steps in cleansing the women of their moral corruption. The basement of the Hudson mansion had been extensively modified during the autumn of 1834, transformed from simple storage cellars into a complex of rooms that served the family's darker purposes. The largest chamber, which Patrick called the Sanctuary of Purification, featured religious iconography, alongside restraining devices that he claimed were necessary to help women overcome their sinful impulses during intensive spiritual counseling. Smaller rooms served as private chambers where individual therapy sessions took place, their stone walls thick enough to muffle any sounds that might disturb the spiritual atmosphere of the institution. Margaret Sutherland would later testify that these evening sessions began with what appeared to be legitimate counseling. Sean Hudson would discuss her spiritual progress, asking probing questions about her thoughts and feelings, identifying areas where additional purification work was needed. But these conversations were actually sophisticated psychological evaluations designed to identify the most effective methods of coercion and control for each individual woman. Sean possessed an almost supernatural ability to understand our fears, Margaret would tell investigators in 1867. He could look at you and know exactly what you were thinking, exactly what would break your spirit or bend you to his will. He used his knowledge of Scripture and his understanding of our deepest shames to convince us that resistance to their methods was actually resistance to God's will for our salvation. The physical aspects of these therapy sessions were presented as medical procedures necessary for moral purification. Kathleen Hudson, who claimed training in female health matters, conducted what she called spiritual examinations to assess the progress of each woman's rehabilitation. These examinations involved intimate procedures that served no legitimate medical purpose, but were presented as essential components of the purification process. Mrs. Hudson explained that sin created physical impurities that could only be cleansed through specific treatments. Margaret testified. She said that our bodies were temples that had been defiled by our moral corruption and that restoration to spiritual purity required intensive physical purification. We believed her because she spoke with such authority and because we had been taught to trust that our suffering was part of God's plan for our redemption. The true horror of the Hudson family system became apparent only gradually as the psychological manipulation deepened and the women's resistance was systematically broken down. By the summer of 1835, the original 12 residents had been joined by 8 more women, creating a population large enough for Patrick to implement the most sinister aspect of his operation, what he privately called his redemption service program. The Hudson family had discovered that there were men willing to pay substantial sums for what Patrick euphemistically termed spiritual guidance sessions with the female residents. These men were presented as benefactors of the institution, devout Christians who wanted to contribute to the moral rehabilitation of fallen women through personal counseling and prayer. They were told that their financial contributions supported the institution's charitable work and that their spiritual guidance helped accelerate the women's path to redemption. In reality, these men were purchasing sexual access to the residents under the guise of religious charity. Patrick had cultivated a network of wealthy clients throughout New York and New England, men who were attracted by the combination of sexual gratification and moral justification that his system provided. They could satisfy their desires while believing they were contributing to Christian charity and the moral improvement of society. The women were told that these sessions were essential components of their rehabilitation, opportunities to practice the submissive behavior that would be expected of them when they returned to society. Resistance was met with increased punishment and extended stays at the institution, while compliance was rewarded with slightly better treatment and promises of eventual release. The psychological pressure was intense. Women who had been systematically broken down over months of manipulation found themselves unable to distinguish between salvation and exploitation. We wanted to believe that our suffering had meaning. Margaret would explain to investigators. The Hudson family convinced us that every humiliation, every violation was bringing us closer to spiritual purity. We clung to that belief because the alternative, accepting that we were simply being tortured and exploited, was too horrible to acknowledge. as 1,835 turned into 1,836. The House of Religious Correction had established itself as a respected institution in Alta County's network of moral reform organizations. Local ministers praised the Hudson family's dedication to Christian charity, noting the substantial donations they made to church-building funds and missionary work. Judge Schuyler regularly recommended the institution to families dealing with moral scandals. Impressed by what appeared to be the Hudson's success in rehabilitating even the most difficult cases, but beneath this facade of Christian virtue, something monstrous had taken root. The Hudson family had created a system that combined religious manipulation, psychological torture, and sexual exploitation into a perfectly functioning machine of human degradation. They had learned to identify and exploit their victims' deepest vulnerabilities, using faith and shame as weapons to maintain absolute control over women who had nowhere else to turn. The shadows of the past were growing longer, with each passing month as more women disappeared into the Hudson mansion, and the family's network of wealthy clients continued to expand. What had begun as Margaret Sutherland's individual nightmare was becoming a systematic enterprise that would eventually destroy hundreds of lives while hiding behind the sacred protection of religious authority. And still, the worst was yet to come. The year 1836 brought subtle but significant changes to the House of Religious Correction, changes that would have alarmed any outside observer who understood their true implications. The Hudson family's operation was expanding both in scope and sophistication, evolving from a crude system of exploitation into something far more organized and terrifying. What had begun as opportunistic abuse was becoming an institution with its own internal logic, its own rules, and its own horrible efficiency. The most visible change was the construction of additional buildings on the mansion's grounds. Patrick Hudson announced that the success of their rehabilitation program had necessitated expansion to accommodate the growing number of families seeking their services. Throughout the spring and summer, local craftsmen worked to erect what appeared to be additional dormitories and workshops, buildings that Patrick claimed would allow them to serve more women while maintaining the intimate family-like atmosphere that made their program so effective. In reality, these new structures served a far darker purpose. The building that Patrick called the Advanced Therapy Center was actually a sophisticated facility designed to accommodate the most profitable aspects of his operation. The redemption service program that was generating substantial income from his growing network of wealthy clients. Private rooms with separate entrances allowed clients to visit without being observed by local residents, while soundproof walls ensured that no disturbing noises would escape to the outside world. The second new building, labeled the Contemplation Retreat, was designed for what Patrick privately called his special cases, women who had proven particularly resistant to the institution's methods or who had attempted to escape. This facility featured smaller, more secure cells, where the most troublesome residents could be subjected to intensive spiritual counseling until their resistance was completely broken. The building's basement included what Patrick euphemistically termed purification chambers, where the most extreme therapy sessions took place. Margaret Sutherland, now 18 months into her stay at the House of Religious Correction, had witnessed the construction of these new facilities with growing horror. Her initial shock and resistance had been systematically worn down through months of psychological manipulation, physical abuse, and carefully orchestrated shame. She had learned to comply with the Hudson family's demands, not because she believed in their methods, but because resistance brought punishments that were exponentially worse than submission. By 1836, I no longer recognized myself. Margaret would later testify. The young woman who had arrived at that house was gone, replaced by someone whose only thoughts were about survival and avoiding punishment. I had seen what happened to women who continued to resist. Some disappeared entirely, supposedly transferred to other institutions or returned to their families, but we never heard from them again. Others were kept in the basement chambers for weeks at a time, emerging as broken shells who would agree to anything rather than be sent back down there. The disappearances that Margaret mentioned had begun in late 1835, though the true scope of what was happening wouldn't be understood for decades. Women who proved too troublesome or who threatened to expose the institution's methods were dealt with through what Patrick called advanced placement programs. Families were told that their daughters had been transferred to specialized facilities, better equipped to handle their particular moral deficiencies, or that they had completed their rehabilitation and been placed in domestic service positions in distant cities. In reality, these women were being sold to brothel in New York City and other major urban centers, or simply murdered when they posed too great a risk to the Hudson family's operation. Patrick had developed relationships with criminal organizations that were willing to pay substantial sums for young women who had already been broken by months of systematic abuse. These transactions were conducted with the same business-like efficiency that characterized all aspects of the Hudson family's enterprise. The most chilling aspect of these disappearances was how seamlessly they were integrated into the institution's normal operations. Other residents were told that the missing women had graduated from the program and returned to their families, or that they had been blessed with opportunities to serve God in other capacities. Letters supposedly from these women would arrive periodically describing their happiness in their new lives and thanking the Hudson family for their spiritual guidance. These letters were actually written by Shah Hudson, who had developed considerable skill at mimicking different handwriting styles and capturing the voice patterns that made each letter seem authentic. He had studied samples of each woman's writing during their intake process, creating detailed notes about their vocabulary, sentence structure, and personal mannerisms that allowed him to produce convincing forgeries for months or even years after their disappearance. Sean was the most frightening of the three siblings, Margaret would recall. Patrick was cruel and Kathleen was cold. But Shah was something worse. He was evil disguised as goodness. He could look at you with those gentle brown eyes and speak in that soft, compassionate voice while describing the most horrible things as acts of Christian charity. He convinced us that our suffering was holy, that our degradation was actually elevation, that our despair was really hope in disguise. By the autumn of 1836, the House of Religious Correction housed 37 women, making it one of the largest moral reform institutions in New York State. The expansion had been funded through the profits from the Hudson family's various enterprises, the sale of goods produced by the residents, the fees paid by families, and the substantial sums generated by the Redemption Service Program. Patrick had also begun investing in other ventures, using his profits to purchase property throughout Alta County and establish business relationships that would provide additional income streams. The Hudson family's growing wealth and apparent success had made them prominent figures in Alta County's religious community. Patrick was invited to speak at ministerial conferences about his innovative approaches to moral correction. While Kathleen became a sought-after advisor to other women involved in charitable work, Shah was being considered for ordination as a minister, his gentle demeanor and apparent theological sophistication making him a favorite among local church leaders. This public success provided perfect cover for the increasingly sophisticated criminal enterprise operating within the House of Religious Correction. The Hudson family had learned to present exactly the image that their community wanted to see: devout Christians dedicated to the challenging work of moral rehabilitation. Successful innovators who had discovered effective methods for redeeming even the most fallen women. But beneath this carefully constructed facade, the reality was becoming increasingly monstrous. The Hudson family had perfected their system of exploitation, developing methods of psychological control that could break down even the strongest personalities within months. They had established networks for disposing of troublesome residents and generating fraudulent correspondence that convinced families their daughters were thriving in their new lives. They had created a criminal organization that combined religious manipulation, sexual exploitation, human trafficking, and murder into a smoothly functioning enterprise that generated enormous profits while hiding behind the protection of religious authority. The most terrifying aspect of their success was how completely they had convinced themselves that their actions were justified. Patrick genuinely believed that he was providing a valuable service to society by removing morally corrupt women from their communities and putting them to productive use. Kathleen saw herself as a pioneering researcher into female psychology. Developing innovative methods for controlling and directing feminine behavior, Sean remained convinced that he was serving God's will by helping fallen women find their proper place in the divine order. This self-justification made them far more dangerous than simple criminals motivated by greed or sadism. The Hudson family operated with the absolute conviction that their cause was righteous, that their methods were necessary, and that anyone who opposed them was working against God's plan for moral order. They had created their own twisted theology that transformed every cruelty into an act of charity, every violation into a sacrament, every murder into a merciful deliverance. As winter approached in 1836, Margaret Sutherland and the other residents of the House of Religious Correction faced the grim reality that there might be no escape from the nightmare they had entered. The Hudson family's power was growing, their methods were becoming more refined, and their operation was expanding in ways that suggested they planned to continue their work indefinitely. The shadows of the past had become a darkness that threatened to consume everything in its path, and the worst horrors were still ahead. The winter of 1837 brought unexpected visitors to Alta County, visitors whose presence would ultimately unravel the Hudson family's carefully constructed empire of exploitation. But first, their arrival would trigger the most violent and desperate period in the House of Religious Correction's history, as Patrick, Kathleen, and Shah Hudson realized that their perfect system might finally face serious scrutiny. The visitors were representatives of the New York State Commission on Charitable Institutions, a newly formed body tasked with investigating reports of irregularities at various reform institutions throughout the state. The commission had been established following a series of scandals involving misappropriation of funds and questionable treatment methods at several facilities, and their mandate was to conduct thorough inspections of any institution that received public recommendations or served clients from multiple counties. Commissioner Henry Caldwell, a distinguished lawyer from Albany, arrived in Kingston on a cold February morning with 2 assistants and a briefcase full of documented concerns about the House of Religious Correction. Several families had contacted the commission with questions about their daughters' prolonged stays at the institution, while others had raised concerns about the lack of visiting opportunities and the suspicious similarity of letters received from their daughters. We had received 17 formal inquiries about the Hudson institution by February 1837, Commissioner Caldwell would later write in his official report. While none of the complainants made specific allegations of wrongdoing, the pattern of concerns was troubling enough to warrant investigation. Families were being told that their daughters required extended treatment periods, with no clear timeline for completion, and several parents reported that attempts to visit had been discouraged or denied entirely. Patrick Hudson received word of the commission's arrival through his network of contacts in Kingston's legal community. Judge Schuyler, who had recommended numerous families to the House of Religious Correction, sent a discreet warning that allowed Patrick time to prepare for what he hoped would be a routine inspection. What Patrick didn't realize was that Commissioner Caldwell was far more thorough than previous investigators, and that he had come prepared to examine not just the institution's facilities, but its financial records and treatment methods as well. The news of impending inspection threw the Hudson family into a state of barely controlled panic. For over 2 years, they had operated with complete confidence in their system's invulnerability, secure in the knowledge that their religious authority provided perfect protection from outside scrutiny. The possibility that state investigators might uncover their true activities forced them to confront the reality that their empire of exploitation might be more fragile than they had believed. Patrick immediately began implementing what he called emergency protocols, procedures he had developed for concealing the most incriminating aspects of their operation should outside scrutiny ever become necessary. The basement chambers were quickly converted to appear as simple storage areas with religious iconography and restraining devices removed or disguised as legitimate medical equipment. The private rooms in the Advanced Therapy Center were reconfigured to resemble additional dormitories, while client access records were hidden or destroyed entirely. More troubling were the measures taken regarding the residents themselves. Women who had been at the institution the longest, those who had witnessed the most extreme aspects of the Hudson family's methods, were quickly transferred to what Patrick called satellite facilities. In reality, these women were being sold to brothel or eliminated entirely, as Patrick couldn't risk having witnesses available who might contradict the official story about the institution's therapeutic methods. Margaret Sutherland, now in her 3rd year at the House of Religious Correction, was among the residents selected for emergency transfer. She had been designated as too dangerous to remain during the inspection, her knowledge of the institution's true operations making her a liability that couldn't be tolerated. On the night before Commissioner Caldwell's scheduled visit, Margaret and 11 other long-term residents were loaded into covered wagons and transported to destinations they would never learn. "I knew that night that we were going to die," Margaret would later testify. "They had always been careful to maintain the fiction that we might eventually be released, but something in Patrick's eyes told me that pretense was over. We were no longer valuable assets. We had become dangerous witnesses who knew too much about their methods." But Margaret's fate would be different from that of her fellow residents, saved by a combination of circumstances that even the Hudson family couldn't have anticipated. The wagon carrying her to her supposed destination broke down during the journey, forcing her guards to seek shelter at a farmhouse owned by Samuel Hartwell, a Quaker minister who had long suspected that something was amiss at the Hudson institution. Hartwell had been troubled by reports he'd heard about the House of Religious Correction, stories that didn't align with his understanding of Christian charity and moral guidance. When he saw Margaret's condition, her obvious malnutrition, the evidence of physical abuse, and her terrified demeanor, he recognized immediately that she was a victim rather than a willing participant in any legitimate rehabilitation program. "Brother Hartwell saved my life that night," Margaret would recall. "When he saw the state I was in, he knew instantly that something terrible was happening at the Hudson Institution. Instead of allowing my guards to continue their journey, he insisted that I remain at his farm to recover from what he called obvious mistreatment. He sent word to his contacts in the abolitionist movement, people who understood how to help women escape from dangerous situations." Margaret's rescue came just hours before Commissioner Caldwell began his inspection of the House of Religious Correction. Patrick Hudson greeted the investigator with his customary combination of religious authority and apparent transparency. Confident that the emergency protocols had successfully concealed the most incriminating evidence of his operation's true nature, he provided tours of the facilities, introduced Caldwell to carefully selected residents who had been coached to provide positive testimonials, and presented financial records that appeared to document a legitimate charitable institution. But Commissioner Caldwell was more perceptive than Patrick had anticipated. Despite the Hudson family's preparations, he noticed details that suggested the institution was not what it appeared to be. The residents he interviewed seemed unusually fearful, and gave responses that sounded rehearsed rather than spontaneous. The facility's financial records showed income levels that seemed inconsistent with a purely charitable operation, while the physical modifications to the mansion raised questions about the true purposes of certain rooms and chambers. Most concerning was the pattern Caldwell observed in the institution's population records. Over 30 women had supposedly completed their rehabilitation and been successfully placed in domestic service during the previous year alone, yet none of their families had reported receiving word of their daughter's new employment. When Caldwell requested to examine correspondence from these supposedly rehabilitated women, Sean Hudson provided letters that seemed authentic but contained subtle inconsistencies that raised the commissioner's suspicions. The handwriting varied in ways that suggested different authors, yet the vocabulary and sentence structures were remarkably similar, Caldwell noted in his preliminary report. When I asked to speak with families who had received these letters, Brother Hudson claimed that confidentiality requirements prevented him from providing contact information. This explanation seemed inconsistent with the institution's stated mission of family reunification. As Caldwell's inspection continued into its second day, Patrick Hudson realized that his emergency protocols might not be sufficient to satisfy the commissioner's scrutiny. The investigator was asking increasingly pointed questions about the institution's methods, requesting access to areas that had been hastily converted from their true purposes, and expressing concern about the psychological state of the current residents. More alarming still was news that reached Patrick through his network of contacts. Margaret Sutherland had been found at Samuel Hartwell's farm and was currently under the protection of Quaker abolitionists, who were known for their willingness to challenge institutional authority. If Margaret began talking about her experiences at the House of Religious Correction, she could provide testimony that would destroy the Hudson family's carefully constructed facade. The pressure of potential exposure triggered something close to madness in the Hudson siblings. Patrick, who had always maintained tight control over every aspect of their operation, began making increasingly desperate decisions. He dispatched men to retrieve Margaret from the Hartwell farm, instructing them to use whatever force was necessary to prevent her from speaking with investigators. He also began making preparations to eliminate Commissioner Caldwell himself, reasoning that the investigator's death could be attributed to bandits or accidents common to winter travel. Kathleen's response to the crisis revealed the depths of her psychological detachment from normal human emotion. Rather than showing concern about potential exposure, she became obsessed with preserving her detailed records of the residents' psychological and physical responses to their treatment methods. She spent hours burning documents that could incriminate the family while carefully preserving what she considered her most valuable research data, apparently believing that her work had genuine scientific merit that justified the suffering it had caused. Shah's reaction was perhaps the most disturbing of all. The gentle pastoral demeanor that had been so effective in manipulating residents and gaining community trust began to crack under pressure, revealing glimpses of the calculating predator beneath. He started conducting what he called emergency spiritual counseling sessions with the remaining residents, using increasingly extreme methods to ensure their silence about the institution's true operations. Brother Shah became terrifying during those final days. One of the surviving residents would later testify. The compassionate mask he had always worn began to slip, and we could see the hatred and contempt he felt for all of us. He told us that if anyone spoke to the investigators about our misunderstandings of the treatment program, we would be sent to places that would make the House of Religious Correction seem like paradise. Just when we thought we'd seen the depths of the Hudson family's depravity, their desperation would drive them to commit acts that shocked even the hardened investigators who eventually uncovered the full scope of their crimes. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happened when Commissioner Caldwell's investigation collided with Margaret Sutherland's testimony. The collision between Margaret's rescue and Commissioner Caldwell's investigation would trigger a series of events that would ultimately expose one of the most sophisticated criminal operations in American history. But first, the Hudson family would make one final desperate attempt to preserve their empire of exploitation, an attempt that would reveal the true depths of their monstrosity and lead to consequences that would echo through Alta County for generations. On the morning of the 18th of February, 1837, as Commissioner Caldwell prepared to expand his investigation based on the disturbing inconsistencies he had observed, word reached the House of Religious Correction that Margaret Sutherland was not only alive, but actively cooperating with Quaker abolitionists who were documenting her testimony. The news struck the Hudson family like a thunderbolt, shattering their confidence that the situation could still be controlled through their usual methods of manipulation and intimidation. Patrick's immediate response was to dispatch his most trusted associates, men who had served as guards and enforcers throughout the institution's operations, to neutralize what he saw as an existential threat to everything they had built. These were not gentle religious counselors, but hardened criminals who had been drawn to the Hudson operation by the combination of steady pay and the opportunity to abuse vulnerable women with impunity. But the Quaker community that had taken Margaret under their protection was not defenseless. Samuel Hartwell and his associates were part of the Underground Railroad network that had developed sophisticated methods for protecting refugees and witnesses from those who would silence them. When Patrick's men arrived at the Hartwell farm, they found it defended by armed abolitionists who were prepared for exactly this type of confrontation. The attempted assault on the Hartwell farm became the first open act of violence in what would escalate into a conflict that shattered the Hudson family's facade of religious respectability. When Commissioner Caldwell learned that armed men from the House of Religious Correction had attacked a Quaker farm in an attempt to retrieve a potential witness, he immediately understood that his investigation had uncovered something far more serious than financial irregularities or questionable treatment methods. Meanwhile, back at the Hudson mansion, the remaining residents found themselves caught in an increasingly volatile situation. As the family's desperation drove them to abandon any pretense of maintaining their therapeutic mission, Shah Hudson began conducting what he called final purification rituals, sessions that seemed designed more to traumatize the women into complete silence than to serve any therapeutic purpose. His gentle demeanor had been completely replaced by open threats and barely controlled violence. He told us that if the institution was forced to close, We would all be transferred to places where no one would ever find us, recalled Sarah Peaton, one of the few residents who would survive to testify about this period. He described in detail what would happen to women who betrayed their Christian benefactors, painting pictures of suffering that made our current situation seem merciful by comparison. Kathleen Hudson's response to the crisis revealed perhaps the most chilling aspect of the family's psychology. Rather than showing concern about potential criminal prosecution, she remained focused on what she considered her life's work: the systematic study and documentation of female psychological responses to various forms of manipulation and abuse. She spent the crisis period organizing her research notes and attempting to preserve what she saw as valuable scientific data. Mrs. Hudson seemed to believe that history would vindicate her methods, Margaret would later testify. She spoke about her work as if she were conducting important research that would benefit future generations of women. The idea that she was simply torturing innocent people for her own gratification seemed genuinely foreign to her understanding of her actions. As news of the confrontation at the Hartwell farm spread throughout Alta County, Commissioner Caldwell realized that he was dealing with a criminal conspiracy that extended far beyond the Hudson family itself. The men who had attacked the Quaker farm were not random criminals, but part of an organized network that had been operating under the protection of religious authority for years. This realization prompted him to request additional investigators and to begin examining the connections between the House of Religious Correction and other individuals and institutions throughout the region. The investigation that followed would eventually reveal that the Hudson family had been operating what amounted to a criminal empire that combined human trafficking, sexual exploitation, fraud, and murder into a sophisticated enterprise that had generated enormous profits while hiding behind the facade of Christian charity. But before that full scope could be understood, the Hudson family would make one final desperate attempt to destroy the evidence of their crimes and eliminate the witnesses who could testify against them. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine whether decades of systematic abuse would finally be exposed to justice, or whether the Hudson family's empire of exploitation would survive to continue destroying lives for years to come. The battle for Margaret Sutherland's testimony had become a battle for the souls of everyone who had suffered within the walls of the House of Religious Correction, and the outcome would determine whether their torment had any meaning or whether it would remain forever hidden in the shadows of Alta County's dark past. The final confrontation came on the 25th of February, 1837, during a blizzard that would later be remembered as one of the most severe winter storms in Alta County's recorded history. The storm provided perfect cover for what Patrick Hudson intended to be the definitive elimination of all threats to his operation. A plan so ruthless and comprehensive that it revealed the true depths of the evil that had masqueraded as Christian charity for nearly 3 years. Commissioner Caldwell had established temporary headquarters at the Kingston Courthouse, where he was coordinating with federal marshals and local authorities to conduct a thorough investigation of the House of Religious Correction. Margaret Sutherland's testimony, now formally recorded and corroborated by physical evidence from the Hartwell farm incident, had provided the foundation for what was becoming the largest criminal investigation in New York State's history. But Patrick Hudson had no intention of allowing that investigation to continue. Drawing on resources accumulated through years of profitable exploitation, he had assembled what amounted to a private army of criminal associates, corrupt officials, and desperate men who had been compromised by their participation in his various enterprises. His plan was elegant in its simplicity: eliminate all witnesses, destroy all evidence, and disappear with the substantial wealth he had accumulated, leaving behind only the burning ruins of an institution that would be remembered as the victim of a tragic accident. The assault began at midnight as the blizzard reached its peak intensity. Hudson's forces attacked simultaneously on 3 fronts: the courthouse, where Commissioner Caldwell was coordinating the investigation, the Hartwell farm, where Margaret Sutherland was providing additional testimony, and the House of Religious Correction itself, where the remaining residents represented potential witnesses who could corroborate Margaret's account. At the courthouse, Patrick Hudson led a team of armed men who had gained entry by impersonating federal marshals arriving to assist with the investigation. Their goal was to seize and destroy all documentary evidence while eliminating Commissioner Caldwell and his assistants. The plan nearly succeeded. Caldwell was shot twice during the initial assault and would have been killed if not for the intervention of local militia members who had been alerted by the sound of gunfire. The attack on the Hartwell farm was even more violent, as Shah Hudson personally led an assault designed to eliminate Margaret Sutherland and anyone who had heard her testimony. The Quaker defenders fought with desperate courage, but they were outnumbered and outgunned by men who had been hardened by years of criminal activity. The farmhouse was set ablaze during the fighting, forcing the defenders to choose between burning alive and facing Hudson's men in open combat. But it was at the House of Religious Correction itself that the Hudson family's true monstrosity was finally revealed in all its horrific glory. Kathleen Hudson, faced with the prospect of losing her life's work, made the decision to eliminate all remaining evidence of the family's crimes, including the 23 women who were still housed at the institution. Her method was as cold and calculated as everything else she had done. She poisoned the evening meal with arsenic she had been stockpiling for months, intending to create what would appear to be a tragic case of accidental food poisoning. Mrs. Hudson prepared that final meal with the same methodical precision she had brought to everything else, testified Rebecca Dalton, one of only 4 residents who survived by refusing to eat due to illness. She served the poisoned food while delivering a sermon about the redemptive power of suffering, explaining to us that our deaths would be the final act of purification that would cleanse our souls and prepare us for heaven. She seemed to genuinely believe that she was performing an act of Christian mercy. The arsenic poisoning began to take effect within hours, but Kathleen's calculations had been flawed. The dose was sufficient to cause agonizing illness, but not immediate death, leaving most of the women conscious and aware as they endured hours of terrible suffering. Their screams and pleas for help echoed through the mansion's corridors, creating a cacophony of agony that would haunt the few survivors for the rest of their lives. As the poisoned women suffered and died throughout that terrible night, Patrick Hudson returned from his failed assault on the courthouse to find his carefully constructed empire collapsing around him. Commissioner Caldwell had survived the attack and was coordinating a massive law enforcement response. Federal marshals were converging on Alta County from throughout New York, and reports were arriving that several of his criminal associates had been killed or captured during the various assaults. Most devastating of all was the news that Margaret Sutherland had not only survived the attack on the Hartwell farm, but had managed to escape with additional witnesses who could corroborate her testimony. Samuel Hartwell and 2 other Quakers had died defending her, but their sacrifice had ensured that the evidence needed to destroy the Hudson family would survive and reach the authorities. Faced with the complete failure of his plans, Patrick Hudson made one final decision that revealed the depths of his megalomania and twisted psychology. Rather than attempt to escape or negotiate some form of plea arrangement, he chose to transform the House of Religious Correction into a funeral pyre that would consume all remaining evidence of his crimes, while providing him with what he saw as a martyrdom worthy of his self-perceived status as a religious visionary. Throughout that nightmarish evening, as poisoned women died in agony in the dormitories above, Patrick systematically destroyed all records of the institution's operations while preparing the mansion for destruction. He soaked the wooden floors and furnishings with lamp oil, arranged papers and ledgers to feed the flames, and wrote what he intended to be a final testament, explaining his actions as the inevitable result of society's failure to appreciate his visionary approach to moral correction. "I have devoted my life to the sacred work of purifying fallen women and restoring them to Christian virtue," Patrick wrote in his final statement. "The corrupt world has rejected my methods because they lack the courage to acknowledge the extreme measures necessary to cleanse souls tainted by sin. History will vindicate my work when future generations understand that true redemption requires absolute surrender of individual will to divine authority." The fire that consumed the House of Religious Correction began just before dawn on the 26th of February, 1837, as the blizzard finally began to subside and the first light of day revealed the full scope of the night's carnage. Patrick Hudson died in the flames, along with his brother Shah, who had returned from the failed assault on the Hartwell farm to join what he saw as their final act of defiance against a world that had failed to appreciate their divine mission. Kathleen Hudson survived the fire, but was captured while attempting to flee with a wagon full of her research documents and personal possessions. Her arrest marked the end of the Hudson family's reign of terror, But the full scope of their crimes was only beginning to be understood as investigators sifted through the evidence that had survived the night's violence. The charred ruins of the House of Religious Correction would smolder for days, the smoke visible from miles away serving as a grim monument to 3 years of systematic cruelty disguised as Christian charity. But even as the physical evidence of their crimes turned to ash, the testimony of survivors like Margaret Sutherland would ensure that the Hudson family's legacy of horror would not be forgotten. The battle was over, but the reckoning was just beginning. The investigation that followed the destruction of the House of Religious Correction would eventually be recognized as one of the most comprehensive criminal investigations in American history up to that time. Commissioner Henry Caldwell, despite his injuries from the courthouse assault, supervised a team of federal marshals, state investigators, and local authorities who worked for months to uncover the full scope of the Hudson family's criminal enterprise. The evidence they uncovered was staggering in its scope and horrifying in its detail. Financial records recovered from Patrick Hudson's other properties revealed that the House of Religious Correction had generated over $47,000 in profits between 1834 and 1837. An enormous sum that represented the monetary value of 3 years of systematic human trafficking, sexual exploitation, and fraud. The money had come from multiple sources: fees paid by families, profits from the sale of goods produced by forced labor, payments from the network of wealthy clients who had purchased access to the residence, and proceeds from the sale of women to brothel and other criminal enterprises. More disturbing were Kathleen Hudson's research documents, which had survived both her attempt to preserve them and the fire that consumed the mansion. These papers provided a detailed record of her systematic study of psychological manipulation and physical abuse, documenting the methods she had developed for breaking down her victims' resistance and maintaining control over them. Her notes read like a manual for human exploitation, written with the clinical detachment of a scientist, documenting experimental procedures. Mrs. Hudson's records revealed a level of systematic cruelty that shocked even experienced investigators. Commissioner Caldwell wrote in his final report, she had documented the psychological and physical responses of individual women to various forms of abuse, noting which methods were most effective for different personality types. Her work represented a deliberate and scientific approach to human degradation that was unlike anything we had encountered in our investigation of other criminal enterprises. The testimony of survivors, led by Margaret Sutherland's courageous decision to speak publicly about her experiences, provided human context for the documentary evidence. Margaret's account of her 3 years at the House of Religious Correction became the foundation for understanding how the Hudson family had managed to maintain their operation for so long while convincing both victims and community members that they were conducting legitimate religious work. Margaret Sutherland's testimony was crucial not just for its factual content, but for its demonstration of how intelligent, capable women could be systematically broken down through psychological manipulation, disguised as spiritual guidance, noted Dr. Samuel Richardson, a physician and early researcher into what would later be understood as psychological trauma. Her account showed how religious authority could be weaponized to justify the most extreme forms of abuse, and how victims could be convinced to participate in their own exploitation through carefully constructed systems of reward and punishment. The trial of Kathleen Hudson, the only surviving member of the family, became a sensation that drew attention from throughout the United States and Europe. Legal observers were fascinated by the question of how to prosecute someone whose crimes had been committed under the guise of religious charity, while medical experts debated whether Kathleen's apparent lack of normal emotional responses indicated mental illness or simply extreme moral corruption. Kathleen herself seemed genuinely puzzled by the charges against her, maintaining throughout the trial that her work had been scientifically valuable and morally justified. She expressed regret only for the premature termination of her research, lamenting that she had not been able to complete her studies of female psychological responses to various therapeutic interventions. Her testimony revealed a mind so thoroughly disconnected from normal human empathy that even her own defense attorneys struggled to present her as anything other than a monster. I have devoted my life to understanding the female mind and developing effective methods for correcting moral deficiencies, Kathleen testified during her trial. Every woman who entered our institution was already fallen, already corrupted by sin. My methods may have seemed harsh to those who lack scientific training, but they were based on careful observation and systematic experimentation. The women under my care received treatments that were specifically designed for their individual psychological needs. The trial lasted 6 weeks and attracted spectators from throughout the region, many of whom came simply to see the woman who had become known as the Alta County She-Devil. Kathleen was ultimately convicted on multiple counts of murder, kidnapping, fraud, and what the court termed criminal conspiracy to commit acts of moral turpitude. She was sentenced to death, becoming one of the first women in New York State history to receive capital punishment for crimes committed under the guise of religious authority. Kathleen Hudson was executed by hanging on the 15th of November, 1838, maintaining her composure and her conviction that her work had been scientifically valuable until the very end. Her final statement, read by the prison chaplain because she refused to speak publicly, continued to defend her methods as necessary innovations in the field of moral correction that had been misunderstood by people who lacked the courage to confront the realities of human nature. The broader investigation revealed that the Hudson family's network had extended far beyond Starr County, involving corrupt officials, criminal organizations, and wealthy individuals throughout New York and New England. Over 40 people were ultimately prosecuted in connection with the case, including judges, ministers, and business leaders who had knowingly participated in or benefited from the Hudson family's criminal enterprise. The scandal led to significant reforms in the oversight of charitable institutions throughout New York State, establishing new requirements for inspection, documentation, and external review of facilities that claimed to provide moral or medical treatment. The Hudson reforms, as they came to be known, served as a model for similar legislation in other states and helped establish the principle that religious authority could not serve as a shield for criminal activity. Margaret Sutherland, whose courage in testifying had been crucial to exposing the full scope of the Hudson family's crimes, became a prominent advocate for institutional reform and support for survivors of abuse. She married Samuel Hartwell's son, Thomas, in 1839 and spent the rest of her life working with Quaker organizations to help women who had been victimized by similar institutions. Her memoir, published in 1845, became one of the first detailed accounts of systematic psychological abuse and helped establish legal precedents for prosecuting crimes committed under the guise of religious authority. The physical site of the House of Religious Correction was never rebuilt. The burned ruins were left to decay as a reminder of the horrors that had taken place there, and local residents reported that the property remained unsold for decades because no one wanted to live on land associated with such terrible crimes. The foundation stones and basement walls gradually disappeared as locals removed them for other construction projects, as if the community was trying to erase any physical trace of the Hudson family's legacy. But the psychological impact of the Hudson case extended far beyond Starr County. The revelation that respected religious leaders could systematically abuse their authority to commit horrific crimes shattered many people's faith in institutional religion and charitable organizations. Churches throughout New York found themselves facing increased scrutiny and demands for transparency, while families became much more cautious about placing troubled relatives in private institutions. The case also had significant legal implications that extended well into the future. The prosecution's successful argument that religious authority could not provide immunity from criminal prosecution established important precedents that would be cited in future cases involving abuse by clergy and other religious figures. The detailed documentation of the Hudson family's methods also provided early insights into what would later be recognized as systematic psychological manipulation and trauma-based control techniques. Perhaps most importantly, the Hudson case demonstrated how easily communities could be deceived by individuals who understood how to manipulate religious and social expectations. Patrick, Kathleen, and Sean Hudson had succeeded for 3 years, not because they were particularly clever criminals, but because they understood that people wanted to believe in the possibility of moral redemption and were willing to overlook troubling signs if those signs contradicted their fundamental beliefs about Christian charity. The Hudson case taught us that evil often succeeds not through deception, but through the willingness of good people to ignore evidence that contradicts their cherished beliefs, observed Dr. Richardson in his analysis of the case. The residents of Alta County were not stupid or gullible. They were decent people who wanted to believe that institutions claiming to serve God's will were actually doing God's work. The Hudson family exploited that desire for moral certainty to commit crimes that would have been impossible without the protection of religious authority. The investigation also revealed disturbing questions about how many other institutions might be operating under similar facades of religious charity while engaging in systematic abuse. Commissioner Caldwell's team identified at least 12 other facilities in New York and New England that showed suspicious patterns similar to those observed at the House of Religious Correction. While none of these other institutions proved to be as comprehensively criminal as the Hudson operation, several were found to be engaging in financial fraud, inappropriate treatment methods, or exploitation of their residents. The legacy of the Hudson family's crimes continued to influence American society in ways that extended far beyond the immediate legal and regulatory changes their exposure had prompted. The case became a touchstone for discussions about religious authority, institutional oversight, and the vulnerability of marginalized populations to systematic abuse. It also provided early documentation of techniques that would later be recognized as central to understanding how totalitarian systems maintain control over their victims. For the survivors of the House of Religious Correction, the end of the Hudson family's operation marked the beginning of a long and difficult process of recovery that would continue for the rest of their lives. Many of the women who had been rescued from the institution struggled with what would now be recognized as severe psychological trauma, while others found it difficult to readjust to normal social relationships after years of systematic abuse. The women who survived the Hudson institution carried scars that never fully healed. Margaret Sutherland wrote in her memoir, "We had been taught to distrust our own perceptions, to doubt our own worth, and to accept suffering as evidence of spiritual progress. Learning to think and feel for ourselves again was a process that took years, and some of us never fully succeeded in reclaiming the people we had been before our captivity." The financial impact of the Hudson case was also significant, as the state of New York eventually paid substantial settlements to families whose daughters had been victimized by the institution. These payments, totaling over $200,000, represented one of the largest government expenditures for victim compensation in American history up to that time, and established precedents for state responsibility in cases where government officials had failed to prevent systematic abuse. The broader cultural impact of the Hudson case resonated through American society for decades, influencing literature, journalism, and social reform movements in ways that are still visible today. The case provided material for numerous novels and newspaper accounts that helped shape public understanding of how institutional abuse operates and how communities can be complicit in enabling systematic cruelty through their unwillingness to question authority. As the years passed and the immediate shock of the Hudson revelations faded, the case took on almost mythical dimensions in Alta County folklore. Stories about the House of Religious Correction were passed down through generations, often becoming embellished with supernatural elements that obscured the very real human evil that had actually occurred. Some versions claimed the Hudson mansion was haunted by the spirits of murdered women, while others suggested that Patrick Hudson had made deals with diabolic forces to maintain his power over his victims. These supernatural interpretations, while understandable as attempts to make sense of seemingly incomprehensible evil, actually served to diminish the true horror of what had happened at the House of Religious Correction. The real story of how three intelligent, educated people had systematically destroyed hundreds of lives while convincing themselves in their community that they were performing sacred work was far more disturbing than any ghost story, because it demonstrated the capacity for evil that exists within supposedly normal human beings. The Hudson case stands as a permanent reminder that the most dangerous criminals are often not the obviously deranged individuals who commit violent crimes in fits of passion, but the methodical, systematic abusers who understand how to manipulate social institutions and moral frameworks to protect themselves while destroying their victims. Patrick, Kathleen, and Shah Hudson succeeded for 3 years, because they understood that communities want to believe in redemption, that families will pay almost any price to avoid public shame, and that religious authority provides nearly impenetrable protection from outside scrutiny. Their story serves as a warning that remains relevant today. When institutions claim moral authority while operating in secrecy, when families are discouraged from maintaining contact with relatives undergoing treatment, and when victims are taught to interpret their suffering as evidence of spiritual progress, the conditions exist for systematic abuse that can continue for years without detection. The Hudson family's reign of terror ended with fire and death in February 1837. But their legacy continues to influence how American society thinks about institutional oversight, religious authority, and the protection of vulnerable populations. Their crimes were eventually exposed and punished, but only after they had destroyed hundreds of lives and demonstrated how easily evil can hide behind facades of Christian charity and moral reform. This mystery shows us that the most terrifying monsters are often not supernatural creatures or obviously deranged killers, but ordinary people who discover that they can commit unspeakable acts while convincing themselves and others that they are serving a higher purpose. The Hudson family believed until the very end that their work was scientifically valuable and morally justified, a delusion that made them far more dangerous than criminals who at least understand that they are doing evil. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed, or do you think there might be other institutions from that era that operated under similar facades of religious charity while committing systematic abuse? Leave your comment below and share your thoughts about how communities can protect themselves from predators who understand how to manipulate moral authority. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories from America's hidden past, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves dark historical mysteries. See you in the next video where we'll explore another chapter from the shadows of American history that official records tried to forget.